Excellent. My name is Janet Herron, and I am an Alumni Engagement Officer at Memorial and your host for today's event. I hope you're all well and safe as we live through and move forward through these very strange days. I'm here with Jason Geary, Acting Manager of Accessibility Services, located in the Blunden Centre, and PhD student and Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Scholar Andreae Callanan, to moderate their presentation about neurodiversity and the different way our brains absorb and process information. At the Office of Alumni Engagement, we are focused on offering many ways for you to connect with Memorial from anywhere in the world and are working diligently to create opportunities to celebrate, socialize, mentor, learn, and advance both your career and improve your life. Embarking on new and exciting ways to build relationships is vital to our evolution as an institution. You, our alumni and friends, are our greatest ambassadors. You are a worldwide community of professionals, leaders, and change makers who advance the reputation of our university, our province, and our world. Please consider getting involved with our programming. There are mentoring opportunities with 10,000 coffees, occasions to meet up with Newfoundland and Labrador expats through Global NL, and Coastlines, our online Memorial Book Club, features Newfoundland and Labrador authors who are also Memorial alumni. You can find more details about all these initiatives on our website, www.mun.ca/alumni. Now, just a few housekeeping issues before we begin. For those of you who wish to avail of the live closed captioning we're offering during this event, I've posted the link at the top of the chat. Now, all you have to do apparently is just click on it and you'll see the captions displayed. If in layout at the top corner of your screen, if you opt for the focus view, you will see a larger picture of the person who is currently speaking. And I'm going to try and do that right now. There we go. Following Jason and Andrea's joint presentation, the Q&A will begin. Sorry, I just got to move my cursor. Sorry, I've lost my cursor. There we go. My colleague Andrea Warman and I will be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A, so please try to keep your questions short. One note about content. Just a reminder that neither of our panelists are clinicians. They are speaking on today's topic from lived experience and from the perspective of education. So please keep this in mind when posting questions. Also, a reminder that this session is being recorded and you will receive a link in a follow-up email along with some additional resources and information. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our two guests today. Andreae Callanan is a writer, a Memorial PhD student, and a Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Scholar who describes herself as a neurodiversity researcher. Her poetry, essays, and reviews have appeared in The Walrus, Canadian Notes and Queries, Canadian Verse 2, Riddle Fence, CBC.ca, and the Newfoundland Quarterly. Today also marks the publication of her poetry collection, The Debt, which explores the dues we all owe to nature, to those who came before us, and to one another. So congratulations on the book, Andreae. Jason Geary has been an educator for more than 20 years, and throughout that time has been interested in and worked to support neurodiverse learners. The focus of his graduate work in the early 2000s included people with autism and similar work related to neurodiversity. He is currently the very busy acting manager of accessibility services located in the Blunden Centre, Memorial's unit that supports students experiencing barriers to post-secondary education. He is also a neurodiversity parent, advocator, and teacher. So thank you so much to both of you for taking the time to speak to Memorial's alumni and friends today. And now over to Jason and Andreae for the presentation.
Get this shared if we could just get a verification that we're seeing it there. Okay. Wonderful. Alrighty. So thanks, Janet, and thanks for the invitation. This was an invitation to speak on this topic. So I know I'm incredibly happy to speak to this. As an educator and a researcher and a parent of two neurodivergent kids. So thanks very much for the invitation. So I have the challenge of giving an introduction to neurodiversity in about, I think, 10 minutes. So I'll do my best to do that. So I wanted to provide just an overview of what we're going to try to capture today, knowing that the really rich part of this presentation today is likely going to be the discussion. We hope you get something from our presentation, but I know there's many folks here who know as much or more about this topic than we do, so we're looking forward to that. So we'll provide a brief overview of neurodiversity and some terminology that we hope will be helpful as you continue to explore this idea around neurodiversity. We'll talk about neurodiversity as it's couched in the larger diversity discussion and maybe some things to think about. We'll interrogate and push back a little bit about the ideas or the concepts of normal or average, and maybe provide some insight around how we can navigate that going forward and how we can speak about or maybe not speak about normal or averages. And then, of course, one of the most important parts of this presentation is going to be to hear about lived experiences. And as Janet said, we bring our perspectives, as parents, as researchers, as scholars, as teachers, and everyone's experiences are going to be different, but we're hoping that you learn something from this. All right. So let's start with a couple of key terms. So the first term that we want to highlight, of course, is neurodiversity, and so this term has been around for a couple of decades now, but it's still, as the president mentioned in her video, still slowly gaining traction. And so, what is this? What is neurodiversity? And quite simply, it's brain differences or a viewpoint that highlights those brain differences between individuals or even within individuals. And so that, in a nutshell, that is neurodiversity, is highlighting those brain differences. It was coined back in the 1990s by activist scholar Judy Singer to look at how we can speak about these differences without medicalizing them, and again, looking at variability. So this is a natural variability amongst humans, and how can we frame that discussion? Of course, it started in the world of autism right about the time when I was going through undergrad and grad school. And it kind of took off and began to look at other areas of neurological difference. So looking at specific learning disorders, sensory processing disorders, and it's captured a number of conditions. And some would argue that everyone is neurodivergent in some way, shape, or fashion. But it did kind of start with having those particular diagnoses and looking at those and how we can talk about those differences, and talk about disability, but also talk about variability. The other term that we want to highlight, because again, you'll read it and hear it in our discussion, is neurodivergent. And that just refers to somebody who is considered neurodiverse. So for example, how we would use that is I try to highlight the many strengths of my two neurodivergent kids. And so using that as an opportunity to highlight neurodiversity where it exists. And the other term that we thought it was very helpful to introduce, for some of you, it's not an introduction, but for some of you it may be, and it's this idea, this term neurotypical, or NT, which we often refer to in our own inner circles when we have these discussions. And it's essentially when we refer to ourselves or somebody as neurotypical, it's basically someone without that diagnosis or without any of those neurological conditions or neurodevelopmental conditions that are kind of encapsulated in neurodivergence. And so an example of that would be my partner identifies as neurotypical. I don't know about that, but so that would be how we could use that phrase. And I think it's a wonderful replacement for normal. And we'll talk a little bit about that more as we go through, but I think it's a wonderful substitution for normal. Okay, so as I mentioned, where this came from started in autism and autism circles and in advocacy groups where there were or are specific diagnoses. And we do know, again, we're not clinicians, but we live and work in this world. We do know that a lot of the models for support rely on a diagnosis. And so not only obtaining a diagnosis, but also sharing that diagnosis with teachers, school districts, employers, in order to get access to and to be connected with folks who know us or who understand some of the challenges that we present with. And I think it is important to acknowledge that piece around disability, because it's really where it came from. And even within the neurodiversity community, there are different perspectives on this, which again, I'm sure some of our attendees are familiar with. And but it's not just looking at disability. And so in that same community of neurodiversity researchers and individuals who identify and live with neurodivergence, there's also, a strong support for looking at some of the functional impairments that come with being neurodivergent as a superpower. And I know Andrea will talk more about that, but even reflecting on my own neurodivergent kids, there are aspects of their disability that may not be quite as disabling as we think or hope. And so I think that gives us some perspectives when we look at neurodiversity, to not take away from the fact that there are parts of these conditions, which I mentioned earlier, and others that can be quite impairing and disabling. So we certainly want to make sure that we highlight these particular camps within the neurodiversity community. One additional challenge that we've seen, and I've seen it professionally, and I've seen it in colleagues of mine and friends of mine, is the idea of going through almost your entire life as a learner, as an employee, as a parent, as a spouse, as a partner, without a diagnosis. And so we do know, and I have several friends and colleagues who received a diagnosis quite late in life. And there are folks, of course, who go through their entire lives without receiving or wanting, and sometimes not needing a diagnosis, a formal diagnosis. So part of what I'm hoping we do today is to present these ideas around diagnosing and maybe not needing a diagnosis. And I think ultimately, the bulk of what we'll speak to is that there are a lot of things that we can do to support certainly learners, to support employees, to support our spouses potentially, and our kids who may or may not have a diagnosis, but there are things that we can do. There's ways that we can make our classrooms and our workplaces more inclusive, even if there is no diagnosis. The other piece I wanted to highlight was many of us, and I do identify as neurotypical, but there are many traits that we often possess as neurotypicals or alleged neurotypical folks that are actually neurodivergent, but they just haven't been, again, diagnosed or picked up, but they're there. And there are little nuances, and someone would recognize those as, I think there's a little bit of neurodivergence there. And I think that's wonderful. And again, part of what we want to present is we need to celebrate that as well. And finally, as I've mentioned, we don't have to simply rely on, as teachers, as administrators, as employers, as coaches, we don't, and certainly parents and partners, we don't have to rely on the presence of a diagnosis to make some meaningful inclusive approaches, whether it's in our houses, in our classrooms. And so I think it's important that we do look at the the diagnostic piece, but not simply relying on that or looking at the absence of a diagnosis as a reason not to do something that could have a tremendous impact. So I also want to present the idea that potentially the concept of neurodiversity is often left out of the larger diversity discussion. And it could be that oftentimes it's hidden, so it's not visible, and we can't count it unless there's some level of self-disclosure, self-identification. And so I think it is important for us to consider, as we consider other aspects of diversity, that we're also thinking about some of those, and neurodiversity isn't the only one, but to think about some of those hidden dimensions of diversity, and how are we not only celebrating diversity, but also looking at, which is a little harder, is inclusion. Right. So if we look at diversity, generally something we can count, right? So how many learners do we have with? And of course, as Janet said, you know, I lead a fine folks at the accessibility office. And so at any point in time, we can count how many students we're supporting with autism spectrum disorder. The harder part of this diversity and inclusion discussion is the inclusion piece. So how are we, knowing that we have these folks in our university, in our classrooms, in our workplaces, how are we then providing and supporting them in the workplace or in the classroom? And so in the literature, we'll often see diversity as getting the talent and inclusion as keeping the talent. And I always like that, because it really encourages us to focus on, now that they're here, now that we know these folks are here, they're in our classrooms, they're in our workplaces, how can we keep them, and how can we truly make our workplaces more inclusive? And finally, I just want to introduce the idea of pushing back against this idea of the average or normal. So we now have a term, neurotypical, to replace with average, but to push back a little bit about what is normal and what is average. And so I would suggest that we've all had these conversations, you know, with our colleagues or our partners, where we're trying to describe something that's normal. And even when we say normal, we know that, well, what is normal, what is average. So I think it helps in the neurodiversity and looking at those similar frameworks, that we push back a little bit against normal and against average. And I've tried to do that in many of the circles that I've been in, and particularly as an educator, to not look for or design experiences or classrooms for average learners, because we know they don't exist. From the brain research, we know there is no average learner. There are scholars and researchers and educators who actually argue that if we design our classrooms, for example, for the average learner, then we're actually designing them for no one, because there is no average learner. Because the things we've tried to measure that would make up an average learner, there's a lot of problems with that, because these dimensions are fluid, they're changing. We know that students are going to be different on a Monday morning than they are on a Friday afternoon. And this jaggedness principle, or the fact that many of these dimensions that we try to measure, whether it's size or intelligence, we know that they change, and trying to get the average actually may design an experience or a workplace or a classroom for nobody. And I think it's worth repeating here this idea of variability. So I started our conversation saying that neurodiversity was acknowledging these naturally occurring variances in the human population. And I think that's so important, while not forgetting that there are going to be individuals that have certain needs beyond what we can predict or presumably predict. But we can predict ways that our students, our employees, our partners will want to interact and live and be and learn. And this is the idea of systematic variability. We know how we can design these better to be more inclusive, to be more accessible. And using that idea to plan and design and make these workplaces or classrooms, or sometimes our homes, you know, more inclusive and acknowledging of neurodivergence. I will hand it over to Andrea.
Thank you, Jason. I'm going to set my little timer here because otherwise we're in trouble. Thank you so much for that. And thank you, Janet, for the introduction. I'm just going to quickly introduce myself. So as we mentioned, I'm a poet, I'm a scholar, and I am a critical autism studies researcher in the humanities, which means that much of what I read is writing about autism by autistic people. So I'm looking at stuff written in people's own voices. So even though I'm talking about my own experiences, if I'm speaking in generalizations, those are coming from research that I've done that is, fairly broad. So I have ADHD. I am autistic. I am the parent of neurodivergent children. I am a child of neurodivergent parents, but I didn't know any of this until a few years ago, just before I turned 41. I just thought we were all a little bit odd. And my sort of story is something that's quite typical among people of my generation, is that one of my children was flagged for a diagnosis in school. And I said, they don't need to be screened for anything. That's just what we're like. And that is just what we're like. And they did need to be screened for something. And it turned out that it was ADHD and autism. And this is a really common experience. So it's a common experience, but it's not the only experience. So even though my experiences of not having been diagnosed and now what I'm experiencing having been diagnosed with ADHD and working through the autism diagnosis process, those things have been frustrating, but they have not been compounded by racism, transphobia, homophobia, colonial trauma, all of those things. So I think it's important to recognize that those intersections affect people's health outcomes and even their access to diagnosis and supports in a dramatic way. So I don't want to for 1 second make it seem as though my experience is a reflection of a universal. It's absolutely not. And some of the resources that are going to be provided at the end of this in the email that will go out to everyone, those are from more broad voices to represent sort of the diversity within neurodiversity. So I would urge people to check those out. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah, perfect. So this is me, mere moments after I get home from a long day of playing the role of being neurotypical at work. This is not me, this is Tiana. But you can see by the look on her face, she's run ragged. And that for me is what my experience prior to the last few years really looked like. The work world was so frustrating for me. And I mean, work is hard for everyone. That's why it's work. But if you add in the factors of having to regulate your emotions, having to compensate for not hearing things very well, or having a lag time between when someone speaks and when you understand what they've said, which is audio processing issues there. Having to manage sensory overload, struggles carrying out multi-step tasks, difficulty understanding social codes, all of these things that I was sort of struggling with. And you put that on top of what the job was. It wouldn't matter whether I was, slinging cappuccinos or working behind a desk in a government office. This was how I felt all the time because it took so much energy to just maintain who I was meant to be or who people thought I was through the day. And I'd look around and go, nobody else looks like they're falling apart at the end of the day. What's wrong with me? And fatigue is one of the single most common complaints of people, of adults with undiagnosed neurodiversity issues or neurodivergent conditions. And often that fatigue is misdiagnosed, as mine consistently was, as depression. This is something that's especially common with women and non-binary people, that it's classified as a mood disorder. And of course, when you don't know the difference, you just say, well, I guess depression looks different with everyone, and tiredness is a common thing, so you accept it. But not knowing why I wasn't able to keep up was incredibly frustrating and demoralizing. So next slide, please. And so part of that reason why I was having these struggles is something that's called the spiky profile, which is similar to this jaggedness principle, right? And it's looking at the disparity between the things that you excel at or that you are proficient in and the things that you struggle with. So for most people, everybody has some things they're better at and some things that they have challenges in, right? So this is typically sort of a, a rolling hill. I think of this as the Canadian Shield model, where it's like, okay, I'm pretty good at math, I'm not so good at geography. Or it could be within math, I'm really great at trig, I'm not so good at algebra. And for people with a lot of neurodivergent conditions, one of the things we see is what's called this spiky profile. So you might be really, really good at something, and then another thing that you should be good at, you just struggle with. So I am a PhD student with multiple high-profile scholarships. I've just published a book. Um, you'd think I'd be able to drive a car. I can't drive a car. You'd think I'd be able to order a pizza. That is off the table. That's not going to happen. So looking at these things and going, why can't I do this? Everyone else can do this, right? It causes this huge amount of frustration and self-esteem because it's inconsistent with how we understand intelligence and accomplishment. We have all these milestones that are supposed to be reached in an order and that are all supposed to be reached. And if you don't reach all of them, or you don't reach them in the right order, this can be really frustrating for you and for the people around you. So people are looking at you and saying, I don't understand why a child as bright as you can't tie your shoes, or I can't understand why you still haven't figured out how to learn how to ride a bike, right? So you carry this through your life. So this spiky profile, you see these superpower moments, right? And then you see these deep troughs. And that can lead to a lot of just huge difficulty in adapting to adulthood. So next slide, please. Okay, so I'm just going to list really quickly some common neurodivergent strengths. And these, again, they're some, and they're common. Not everybody has them. Some people have them sometimes, sometimes they don't. So the first is innovative problem solving. Everybody wants out-of-the-box thinkers. Some of us are so far outside the box, we wouldn't know how to find the box if we were looking for it, simply because the way our brains process information is just different. And so we see things differently. We come to different conclusions. And that's an enormous strength. Attention to detail is really common. These are the things, this is what comes out in my poetry. This is what people comment on. It's like, oh, these little details. I'm like, I thought everybody saw that. Apparently it's just me. Pattern recognition is another really common one. It's associated very strongly with autism, but also with other neurodivergent conditions. And that could be anything from, again, poetry, sort of recognizing different metrical patterns, to math. That's a lot of what people see with these math strengths that are common in some neurodivergent people. And also pattern recognitions in visual patterning. So one of the weirdest jobs I ever had, and probably my favorite job I've ever had, is when I was working at McGill University helping build their websites. I don't know anything about building websites, but I was hired to proofread something. They saw I was really good at it. And so they said, can you do that with HTML? And I said, I don't know what HTML is, but show me. And because of that pattern recognition, I was able to just look through pages and pages of this stuff and say, oh, you've got the wrong slash there. And the website was fixed. It was amazing. I don't know how I did it, but I did. Nobody else knew how I did it either. Passion and enthusiasm. I think often there's a lot of stereotyping, especially regarding autistic people, of being sort of monotone and disengaged, and it's a total misrepresentation. I'll talk about that in the last slide. But even when that enthusiasm isn't necessarily visible on the outside, I think passion for learning, passion for collecting information, for, ADHD is the same sort of thing. This sort of deep dive is something that tends to be a common thing that many of us can relate to. Rapid absorption and synthesis of information. It's just the way some brains work, that we just it up and put it together. That may not be represented in other elements of our lives, but when there's something we're interested in, we're on it. Unbiased feedback. For those of us who struggle with understanding social norms, the downside of that is that we often say the wrong thing. But if you want us to say something and not spare your feelings, we can usually do that and say, give a sort of objective analysis of what's going on. So if you're saying, give it to me straight, is this report going to work? Say, yeah, no, that report's not going to work. And we can get you with those details. Making surprising connection between ideas. A lot of what I study has to do with how specifically autistic people make sense of language things, and often things are connected in the brain in ways that are just really intriguing and different from the way other people tend to do it. So that's a thing we can do. And seeking an in-depth understanding of how things work. This is the, so what it's seen as sort of a kind of systematizing way of understanding things, and it's seeing details before one understands the whole. And this can be a real strength in a lot of ways. So next, thank you. So some common neurodivergent challenges, again, just some and common, but not universal. Time management and flexibility is a huge thing. That's part of the diagnostic criteria for a number of these conditions. And that can be in terms of sticking to a schedule, projecting how long something's going to take. And it could also be in terms of changing your schedule. If you're someone who really needs to stick to a schedule and something changes, it can be really difficult to adjust those things. And sometimes both of those things can exist in the same person, and they do for me. Transitioning between tasks, a lot of times there's what I call the lag time between, when you're meant to start a thing, but you're still trying to mentally finish up what you're doing. So building in time between doing tasks is really important. Breaking down tasks into smaller pieces. This is, again, this disparity between seeing, the parts and the whole, and sometimes people can really struggle with that. Asking for help and guidance is a really big thing. And that can be for different reasons. That can originate from that spiky profile and being a little kid and someone saying, you don't need help with that. You're too smart to need help with that. And you really do need help. And it can also come from that breaking down tasks and trying to find out exactly where the thing is going wrong, because finding out breaking down those pieces can be really challenging. And it can also come from just being really proficient in a lot of things and not knowing when something comes along that you're not naturally good at, just being so baffled by it that you never know even where to begin to ask for help. So often you'll see, people will say, oh, I have an open door policy, come in and ask me anytime you're having trouble. But for some of us, even knowing how to do that is really difficult. Approaching tasks strategically can be difficult in terms, again, there's that time management issue and the breaking things down and looking at a huge project and prioritizing which things need to happen in which order can be really challenging, especially with ADHD a lot of the time. Social cues and understanding expectations is an enormous issue. Everything from just casual social relations to that hidden curriculum that exists, in academia and in the business world of things that everybody knows, but no one is going to tell you. Some of us, those curricula are more hidden than for others, right? And the last is exhaustion and energy management, back to this fatigue issue, and just recognizing how much energy I have to put into what's being asked of me and how to make that happen. So next slide, which is the last one. So these are just a few things that I came up with, some suggestions in terms of bridging the gap. So this is if you're in an academic environment, if you're in a business environment, and you're working with people, whether you know that they are neurodivergent or whether they are people who just seem to struggle with some of these issues, and they may, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but could use maybe a little bit of help. And the first I would suggest is clear and direct communication. If your coworkers or your staff are expected to attend the holiday lunch, don't tell them they're invited to attend the holiday lunch, because those are two different things. You wouldn't say that staff are invited to wash their hands before coming back to the office from the washroom. Just make it clear what people are expected to do. Trust that we know our own capabilities and limitations. This is a huge issue in disability experiences generally. Either people look at you and they see a visible disability and they say, oh, well, you're not going to be capable of this. Or they look at you and they don't see a disability and they don't understand why you're saying that you can't do this thing, or you can't do it on this timeline, or you need more resources. We are the experts in our own experience. Please listen to what we're telling you, because it's hard to ask for help. And if we do, please trust that we're doing it because we need it. And with that, be willing to adjust your expectations as our conditions and resources change. And especially for those of us who are coming to know these things in adulthood, we haven't had the time to learn what we need necessarily. So work with us as we're learning and trust us as we're telling you that things are changing. Let us celebrate our achievements and milestones in our own way. If we've just completed a huge contract, we really might not have what it takes to come to the pub with you afterwards. It's no reflection on you or the pub. It's just that we are done. Um, and like the grumpy looking little toad here, know that you can't always read our feelings by our facial expressions. And this is back to this stereotype of a, cold, dispassionate, logical robot person, which I think clearly we can see is not true. Some of that comes from just expressing our emotions differently. Some of this comes from stereotypes about if a person is logical, they can't also be emotional. There's a lot of body language and verbal communication and facial expressions that just doesn't match up. It's like we're speaking two different languages. So if we say, I'm having a great day, I am living my best life, I'm so happy to be here, trust that we mean that and don't look at our and if we look grumpy, we might not be. So I relate a lot to crooked looking little toad here. And I'm going to leave it at that and open it up to some questions. We've got resources that will be going out, and see where the conversation goes. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Jason. And I think Jason's just going to stop sharing his screen.
Thank you for that nudge.
Yeah. And now we can have a conversation. That was awesome. So Jason explained what neurodiversity is, and Andrea told us what it feels like inside. So that's cool. We do have questions, so let's get right to them. We're not going to use people's names just in case. Not that they're, anyway, I'm not going to, don't let me babble. Okay, first question. What do you think of universal design for learning? Is that a question for Jason or Andrea? I think both. Jason, you go.
Well, I love universal design for learning. I've been, it's something that I was introduced to as a grad student in the US in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and I think it has incredible promise. Like, I think anything universal design-ish, even starting with the, those original universal design principles, I think as a UDL practitioner myself, as an educator, it has really helped me, I think, allow students to kind of choose their own adventure through my teaching, and through using those principles. So I'm a huge fan, and have been working in that space for quite a bit. And there's actually quite a bit happening at Memorial around that. So it's exciting time to be here.
Good.
Andrea, how about you?
Yeah, well, what I can add is that, so I teach as well. I teach creative writing, and this last semester or the fall semester, I was teaching obviously from home, like we all were. And so just sort of thinking about these principles, I made my lectures, I pre-recorded my lectures and made them available as captioned videos, as MP3s, and as transcripts, so people could choose what was the most, and largely this had to do with, diversity and disability issues, but it was largely because people have really busy lives, and maybe you need to listen to my lecture while you're on your way to pick up your kid or something like that, right? And my students were really grateful for it. It was a lot of work for me. I'm not going to pretend like this is an easy thing that, any of us can do. And I'm just a grad student and per course instructor, so I don't have someone who I can say, oh, can you finish these transcriptions for me? It was a lot of work, but I think it was absolutely worth it. And I saw a quote earlier on Instagram. There's a writer named Amanda Leduc, and she wrote, "An accessible world is a flexible world." And I think that's a really great way to think about it, that offering that flexibility makes so many people more able to participate.
Okay. Here's a question from someone who has a child has a child who has autism. The child is very smart and talented, specifically in music. She often gets questions like, "Is he a savant?" And she often has to push to have educators see that just because he is of high intelligence and has a near picture perfect memory and significant musical talent, that he still has needs, and that our school system is not set up to meet the needs of neurodivergent students. Specifically, when we get to common assessments, etc., how can we foster change in the system?
Andrea, do you want to take a stab at that?
No, you go first. Commiseration is what I have. I don't have suggestions.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of work to be done. I will say though, as a teacher educator and also as a parent, there has been a lot of work that has been done around this, even just looking at universal design for learning. So there's a lot of work being done now to make sure that teachers, all teachers, not just special educators or IRTs, are knowledgeable about this. So looking at UDL, looking at differentiated learning, looking at some of these approaches to designing and implementing, effective classroom activities that will open it up to a larger number of students. I think the challenge with students who present as gifted, and I know gifted, talented, and creative students, there's been a real dearth of programming specifically for those students. But I would say that when I go to conferences, and Andrea, I don't know if you bump into these folks as well. When I go to UDL conferences, I am interacting with K-12 teachers from our district, from from NLESD. So there is a greater knowledge. Again, I think there's a lot of work to be done in a number of areas, but there has been most recently a focus on universal design for learning and trying to embrace some of these ways that we can meet the needs of a larger population of student. But it's a lot of work to do for sure.
Yeah, we've sort of got a follow-up, and that sort of leads to what you just said. Can you just give a recap of the basic universal design principles? Is that possible for people who aren't aware?
Sure. So universal design for learning, there's a number of different frameworks that kind of lean into universal design principles, the original universal design principles from, built environment and architecture. But universal design for learning specifically looks at providing choice, and Andrea kind of said, in her teaching, she looks at choice, but providing choice, providing flexibility, and focusing on three principles. So there are three principles, or the three guidelines for universal design for learning. And those are multiple ways of engaging. So multiple ways to get students engaged, find out what they care about, and find a way to connect that to what I want them to know. Multiple means of representation. So as Andrea said, looking at how we can get students information, right? We know that not every student wants to digest a 400-page textbook, but they might listen to it. And so are we providing multiple means of representation? And then finally, the third principle is multiple means of action and expression. So are we giving students multiple ways and choice and flexibility to demonstrate what they know? So is it just a paper? Is it just a PowerPoint? And in teacher education, we struggle with this. And I found that looking at these principles, if I'm able to give students choice, I'm amazed. It is a lot of work, Andrea, so I agree with you, but it's amazing what students will produce. And this isn't just university, this is K-12 and in post-secondary as well. It's amazing what students can show you when you set those parameters wide and give them lots of choice. So those are the three basic principles.
Okay, we've had a couple of questions here about testing, and so I'm going to try and wrap a couple of them in together. Someone's asking if it's true that there is more than a 2-year wait list for ADHD or ASK adult diagnosis via public health. Any suggested alternatives within private practice? And then another question, how do you get tested to see if you are neurodivergent? Is it worth looking into potential diagnosis? What would you say the benefits are?
Where to begin? I should say that because I'm a grad student, all of my diagnostic stuff has happened through the university. So I can't speak to anything beyond that. I went through Mun Wellness for my initial ADHD diagnosis, and it's gone from there. But I don't know beyond that. There are some wonderful clinics in St. John's and people who are doing really great work. A lot of them are affiliated with Memorial. So I would say taking that step. But what you can do if people do want to be diagnosed, and there are arguments on either side of this, there are lots of legitimate arguments for not wanting to go that route. And at least with ADHD, it's one thing because you may really benefit from medication. And so you can't get that without a diagnosis, obviously. With autism, if you've made it into adulthood, then you no doubt have a lot of coping skills. And just recognizing something about yourself can be enough to sort of help you sort of make those changes that you need in your life and say, oh, this is why I struggle with this. And just knowing that and being able to avail of information on websites and stuff is hugely helpful. A pretty common step is to just deep dive into the internet and do as many quizzes that start with, I think I'm autistic, or I think I might have ADHD. Do them all, print them off, go to your doctor and say, okay, what do you think? That's kind of a step, but it is difficult. I can't say anything on wait times. I do understand that the province is making some changes there to shorten those wait times, but I can't make any specific recommendations.
Okay. Does the term neurodivergent refer only to things like autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, or does it also apply to conditions like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or other mental health disorders?
You want me to take that one?
You take that. Sorry, I know
So-
that's kind of a, well, you take it. Go ahead.
Yeah. So again, not a clinician,
No.
but I think that, and Andrea, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this too, but there have been many folks who've kind of identified with that kind of framework around neurodivergence and neurodiversity, and they may or may not have a diagnosis, or they may have a diagnosis that doesn't quite fit. But I think there's a growing number of folks that would argue everyone's neurodivergent. And I think that one of the things we try to do, certainly in teaching and learning or in the education field, is someone's not their diagnosis, right? And even though we'll have students that have, let's say, bipolar disorder, not everything they do is going to be a manifestation of that diagnosis, and there might be another diagnosis that's a better explanation. And so, I wouldn't want to limit it only to, it did come out of autism. It did come out of that world. But I think the folks who have led and created where this neurodiversity, field is now, I think are certainly open to say, like, hey, this may or may not be a diagnosis, but kind of look at this and see if it fits. And there's all kinds of things that we can do, even if you don't, recognize or you're diagnosed with ADHD or autism. So I would say yes, that from my perspective, that I think someone with a disorder that maybe isn't traditionally wrapped up in neurodiversity could absolutely find a part of this to grab onto and say, that's me, that sounds like me, and there may be things that we could do to support those learners or their employees.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I've seen a lot recently of sort of including bipolar, Tourette syndrome, any sort of sensory processing issues under this umbrella, and I think that's sensible. Typically, it seems to be hardwiring conditions rather than something that you have acquired later in life. That seems to be the dividing factor. But again, all of these definitions are really malleable. So yeah. And they change quickly.
Okay. Do people normally talk about neurodiversity when they talk about diversity in the workplace? I don't think so.
In my experience, no. And again, I'm not a diversity scholar, and maybe there's somebody who's better able to weigh in that. But in the many diversity conversations that I've been a part of, and I've sat on committees and working groups, that's the challenge around neurodiversity, is the hidden component of that. It's not just neurodiversity, disability status. If in fact it's not visible, if it's hidden, that's also something that it may take someone, at a meeting or a committee to say, hey, we need to think about the things that we can't necessarily see and count. So I don't think it's necessarily captured in that larger diversity conversation, no.
And yeah, if I could add something, I think that, as someone who is an academic and also a writer, so I'm in two kind of worlds, and in both of these worlds, as I've started, speaking about these, conditions that I've, found out of myself, everyone's like, oh, well, half of us are like that, or oh, half the, whatever it is, everyone we know is like that. It's like, well, that may be true. And if it is, why aren't we talking about it? Why am I the only one going, hey, did you hear about my ADHD? Like, if that is the case, then I think I think this sort of like, well, everybody's a little bit like that doesn't really help that much. On one hand, it's fostering these environments where we can be ourselves and we don't have to, feel like we have to put our eccentricities aside to fit in. But at the same time, if you're struggling and you're looking around and going, everyone here is as weird as I am, but I'm the only one who can't handle it. Like what does that say about me, right? So I don't think it's that helpful. I think we do need to measure these diversities and include neurodiversity in that.
Yes, we've got lots of questions and we don't have enough time to ask all of them. So I'm going to just pick a couple of additional questions and then I'm going to ask you for your final thoughts and we're going to have to wrap up. One of the employees on my team is neurodiverse and is on the autism spectrum. The isolation that has come from the pandemic and working from home has been incredibly difficult for his mental health. How can I best support him in the work from home scenario?
I don't know. Jason, do you have any? That's a tough one. That's because I know a lot of neurodivergent people who have thrived not having to go into an office, right?
Yeah,
And so, yeah,
it's a good point. No, I think that's a wonderful question. And I think it highlights, even with a diagnosis, the heterogeneity that comes with a diagnosis. And so I've had the same, I have a friend of mine on the spectrum and I would say to her, isn't this awesome? Like now you're not only do you not have to, you're not allowed to go anywhere. You have to connect virtually and she's not doing so well. And so I think that we need to support individually. And I think that's the other piece that's important. When we do all these things and the list that Andrea provided, even when we do those things, there are going to be nuances and accommodations, kind of workplace accommodations or accommodations in the learning environment that we still need to consider, that we still need to kind of address one-on-one. And so looking at ways with this particular question, I think, exploring some possibilities with that individual to find new ways, different ways to connect. And that often is what the issue is. It's finding that connection, right? That's all I had to add, really.
We have so many questions and there's such great questions. But we just don't have time to get to them all. So I'm going to have to ask, I want to ask though, both Andrea and Jason for their final thoughts and before we wrap things up.
Yeah. Oh, geez, so much. Where to begin? I think. I was thinking of an analogy that could help like everyone wrap our heads around what this all means, like in a way that we can relate to. And I feel like what I came up with is this, and hopefully there are enough gardeners who will get this. Janet, I know you'll get it. Examining a neurodivergent person's life and trajectory and trying to compare it to a neurotypical path is like looking at the weather report for Toronto to try and decide when to put your tomatoes out, right? Like Toronto, we can learn a lot from Toronto gardeners. If you're in Newfoundland, knowing when their frost date is no use to you, right? You're going to have, and if you're in your like backyard Canada Day weekend and you're looking at all these pictures of your friends in Toronto and their gardens and looking at yours, you're going to feel really miserable, right? Because you can't possibly thrive under those circumstances. You're not, that's not you, right? But when when you're gardening, you don't look at a little cucumber plant and say, you're not meant to thrive in this environment, so too bad about you. You're like, no, I'm going to cover you up. I'm going to put some plastic over you. I'm going to give you extra food so we got really strong roots because it needs extra help. So when we're talking about, when we're talking about accommodations, we're talking about greenhouses, right? We're talking about the things that we can do that can help us go, I'm not thriving in this environment, but I bet with a little bit of help I could.
Yeah,
and so that's my little message for everyone to take home.
Beautiful. I love that. Jason, top that.
So no, no, there's nothing as profound as that. But I guess two things. One would be to really start from strengths, right? We've talked a lot about diagnoses and difficulties and challenges. But at the end of the day, we all have strengths. So start with the strengths. And, it's not everyone's going to have all the answers right? Not everyone's going to, whether it's a teacher or an employer or a partner, but start from a place of strength, understanding. And there are resources to help and help folks, formal and informal. The other thing I think I would say is that, having lived through this pandemic now over a year, I think this experience has taught us that we can do things differently, right? When we have to, we can do things differently. And when we no longer have to, we probably should. And so that's one thing that I would say is try to look at some of the lessons we've learned. And when we no longer have to do them, they still might be actually worthwhile. And as Andrea said, there's a number of folks right now, and we see students who are thriving because access means something different now. And so after we kind of transition back to on-campus learning, we're going to have to think about how we can continue to create this level of access for a number of students, but the same thing for employees. And so I'll leave it there.
Oh my God. Thank you so much, both of you. That was just wonderful. We had so many positive comments about the topic and what you've covered, and everyone is really, it's great. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And thank you to everyone who came and watched. We had lots of people out there, and thank you for your great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions. We do have upcoming events, so please don't hesitate to take a look at our alumni website. This session is recorded, and we will be following up with some additional information. I think we're going to include the slides on that email. I think you guys are okay with sharing the slides, correct? And so look out for that in your inboxes coming up in the next few days. And that's it. And so thank you very much for your support of our events, and we see you next time. And thank you again to Andrea and Jason. That was great. And happy Publication Day, Andrea.
Thank you, Janet.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, John.
Bye. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
See you, folks.